The salt spray whipped across the deck of the USS Lexington as dawn broke across the Pacific on October 8, 1943. Lieutenant Commander James Barrett stood motionless, scanning the horizon for Japanese aircraft, while his heartbeat pounded in rhythm with the distant thrum of the carrier's massive engines. 3 decks below, in a cramped compartment crowded with bunks stacked 3 high, Seaman William Morris meticulously pulled the corners of his bedsheet, forming a tight, perfect fold with practiced precision. His knuckles whitened as he tugged the fabric into a flawless hospital corner, the kind that would reflect light like polished glass. Morris knew what the other sailors sometimes whispered when the officers weren't listening, that the Navy's obsession with perfectly made beds was nothing but pointless discipline, a way to break men down through tedium. He had thought the same 6 months ago. But as Japanese Zeros screamed overhead during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Morris had witnessed firsthand how those seemingly meaningless routines, the endless drilling, the spotless uniforms, and yes, those meticulously made beds, had transformed a ragtag collection of civilians into a fighting force that worked as one mind, one body. His fingers worked deftly, pulling the sheets taut enough that a dime would bounce if dropped. As he smoothed the last wrinkle, Petty Officer Daniels appeared, clipboard in hand, his eyes already evaluating the precise angles of Morris's handiwork. A year ago, Morris would have found this morning ritual absurd. Now he understood his life, and the lives of every man aboard might depend on it. "Everything square, Morris?" Daniels asked, his voice low to avoid disturbing sailors, still sleeping after the midnight watch. "Yes, Petty Officer," Morris replied, standing straighter, his chin lifting slightly. Daniels ran a finger along the sheet's edge, checking for the tension that regulations demanded. With a barely perceptible nod, he made a mark on his clipboard and moved to the next bunk. Morris released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Another morning, another inspection passed. In the strange calculus of war, this small victory somehow mattered. No one aboard the mighty aircraft carrier could have predicted that this mundane task, the daily making of a sailor's bed, would later be recognized as one of the United States Navy's most profound tactical innovations of World War II. In the chaos and carnage of warfare, this simple daily ritual would prove to be the foundation upon which America's naval dominance was built. The mathematics of victory were written in hospital corners and tightly drawn sheets, in a battle for discipline that began each morning before the sun rose above the vast Pacific Ocean. And at the center of this unexpected story stood a once overlooked naval officer whose revolutionary approach to discipline would save thousands of American lives before the war's end. The story of Seaman Morris was just one among thousands. In the massive expansion of the United States Navy after Pearl Harbor, when America's fleet would grow from a modest force to the mightiest naval power on Earth, the ordinary routines of shipboard life became extraordinary tools of transformation, and none was more powerful or more misunderstood than the Navy's unyielding insistence on perfectly made beds. In the early months of 1942, as America struggled to recover from the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, the nation's shipyards worked around the clock, launching vessels at a pace unprecedented in human history. But ships alone couldn't win the war. They required crews, hundreds of thousands of men who needed to be transformed from civilians into sailors in a matter of weeks. The challenge was immense. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy consisted of approximately 130,000 personnel. By war's end, that number would swell to over 3,700,000, an expansion of nearly 30-fold. For comparison, imagine a small company of 30 employees suddenly needing to hire and train almost 900 additional workers while simultaneously competing in the most demanding market imaginable. This was the Navy's task, but with stakes measured in national survival rather than corporate profits. Most of these new recruits had never seen the ocean, let alone sailed upon it. They came from farms and factories, from urban tenements and rural homesteads, bringing with them the casual habits and independent attitudes of American civilian life. Yet within weeks, they needed to function as disciplined components of a complex maritime fighting force, where errors could sink ships and cost lives. "We weren't just teaching them to sail or fight," explained Commander Harold Winston, who oversaw recruit training at Great Lakes Naval Station during the early war years. "We were teaching them to think differently, to view themselves not as individuals, but as essential parts of a larger organism, the ship." And for many Americans, that was the hardest lesson of all. Lieutenant Commander James Barrett had not always been a believer himself. Growing up in Appleton, Wisconsin, in the years following the Great Depression, Barrett's family life had been marked by a comfortable disorder. His mother, a schoolteacher with progressive ideas about child rearing, believed that forcing children to adhere to strict routines stifled creativity. Barrett's own bed was rarely made as he moved through childhood into his teen years, and his natural brilliance flourished in this atmosphere of relaxed expectations. The third of 5 children, Barrett showed that an early aptitude for mathematics and engineering that caught the attention of his high school teachers. In 1936, at the age of 18, he secured a coveted appointment to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. His arrival there in the fall of that year marked his first encounter with military discipline, a shock so profound it nearly ended his naval career before it began. "The first morning at Annapolis almost broke me," Barrett would later write in a letter to his younger brother. "At home, I'd roll out of bed whenever I pleased, sheets and blankets in a tangle. Here, they expect us to transform our sleeping quarters from chaos to perfect order in under 2 minutes. My first attempt was a disaster." Barrett's plebe year at the academy proved challenging in ways he hadn't anticipated. While the academic curriculum posed little difficulty for his analytical mind, the rigid requirements of military discipline, standing at attention, marching in formation, and yes, making his bed to exacting standards, tested his resolve daily. 3 weeks into his first semester, after receiving yet another demerit for an improperly made bed, Barrett found himself seriously considering resignation. "I couldn't understand why they cared so much about something so trivial," he later recalled in a 1952 interview with Naval History Quarterly. "I was there to learn navigation, engineering, and tactics, not housekeeping. I thought it was merely hazing, a way to break our spirits." His roommate, Charles Woodward from Virginia, had a different perspective. Raised in a military family, his father and grandfather had both served in the Navy, Woodward approached academy discipline with the ease of familiarity. "You're overthinking it, Barrett," Woodward told him one evening after Barrett had received his third bed-making demerit of the week. "It's not about the bed. It's about training your mind to care about details. At sea, details keep ships afloat and men alive." Barrett remained unconvinced until an unexpected conversation with Commander William Halsey, then an instructor at the academy, and later one of the most celebrated admirals of the Pacific War. Finding Barrett struggling with his bed-making one morning, Halsey didn't offer the expected reprimand. Instead, he posed a question that would transform Barrett's understanding of naval discipline. "Tell me, Barrett," Halsey asked, "if you can't be trusted to master this simple task, one with clear guidelines and immediate feedback, why should the Navy ever trust you with the lives of other men?" The question haunted Barrett. That night, he stayed up past midnight, practicing hospital corners and learning to create the tight, wrinkle-free surface that regulations demanded. By graduation in 1940, Barrett had not only mastered the art of military bed-making, but had developed a deeper appreciation for the psychology behind it. What he initially dismissed as pointless ritual, he came to recognize as deliberate character building. "Halsey helped me understand that military discipline isn't arbitrary," Barrett wrote in his journal. "It's a system designed to create specific habits of mind, attention to detail, adherence to standards, and the commitment to do things right even when they seem insignificant. These are the exact qualities that prevent disasters at sea." Barrett's first posting after Annapolis was aboard the battleship USS Nevada. As a junior officer responsible for a division of 23 sailors, he found himself on the other side of the discipline equation, now enforcing rather than merely following regulations. The experience offered Barrett his first opportunity to observe how small habits shaped sailors' broader performance. The Nevada's captain, Francis Scanland, ran a tight ship, even by Navy standards. Morning inspections were thorough, with particular emphasis on the condition of sailors' racks. Barrett initially worried that this strictness might breed resentment among his division, many of whom were older than he was and had years more sea experience. To his surprise, the Nevada's veteran sailors took pride in these high standards. Chief Petty Officer Malcolm Reed, who had served in the Navy since 1926, explained it to Barrett during one of their watches. "A messy rack means a messy sailor, and messy sailors make mistakes," Reed said. "I've served on ships where standards slipped and trouble always followed. Not just discipline problems, but accidents, equipment failures, things breaking that shouldn't break. It all connects." On December 7, 1941, the USS Nevada was moored at Pearl Harbor when Japanese aircraft launched their devastating surprise attack. The Nevada was the only battleship to get underway during the assault, though she was later intentionally beached to avoid sinking in the harbor channel. Barrett's division suffered casualties, but the survivors responded with remarkable composure and efficiency during the crisis. In the chaotic aftermath, as damage control efforts continued around the clock, Barrett noticed something that others might have overlooked. The sailors from his division, who had been most attentive to detail in their daily routines, including bed-making, were the same ones who now showed exceptional focus and adaptability under pressure. They followed orders precisely, improvised when necessary, and maintained their composure even as explosions rocked the ship and fires raged. They had trained their minds to function amid chaos, Barrett later wrote, not through elaborate battle drills, but through the daily discipline of doing ordinary things with extraordinary precision. This observation planted a seed in Barrett's analytical mind, a hypothesis about the relationship between seemingly mundane routines and performance under extreme stress. Over the next year, as the United States fully mobilized for war and the Navy rapidly expanded, Barrett refined this theory while serving at the Naval Training Station in Great Lakes, Illinois, where he helped develop protocols for transforming civilians into sailors. Great Lakes, located north of Chicago on the western shore of Lake Michigan, was the Navy's largest training facility. By mid-1942, it was processing thousands of recruits weekly, with new arrivals streaming in daily from recruitment stations across the Midwest and beyond. Many had never before left their home states. Few had any concept of the naval service they were entering. For these young men, most were between 17 and 24, the first weeks of naval training represented a jarring transition. They surrendered their civilian clothes, had their heads shaved to prevent lice, and found themselves subject to a regimen of absolute obedience that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives. The challenge was immense, Barrett explained in his post-war memoirs. We didn't have the luxury of time. We couldn't gradually acclimate civilians to military life. We needed to transform them quickly and completely to replace civilian mindsets with naval discipline. And we needed to identify which men could handle the pressures of combat and which couldn't. Drawing on his Pearl Harbor observations, Barrett advocated for a training approach that emphasized mastery of basic routines as indicators of combat readiness. Chief among these was the proper making of a sailor's bed, or rack in Navy terminology. Barrett argued that this simple task contained all the elements needed to evaluate a recruit's potential: attention to detail, adherence to standards, time management, and pride in workmanship. The training program that emerged from Barrett's input was rigorous by any standard. Recruits at Great Lakes rose at 5:30 each morning when lights blazed on in their barracks. They had precisely 12 minutes to use the head, wash, dress, and make their racks before the first inspection of the day. The standards were exacting, Sheets pulled drum-tight with precise hospital corners, blankets folded with edges perfectly aligned, and all personal items stowed in exactly the prescribed manner. Initially, Barrett's emphasis on bed-making met with skepticism from some senior officers who saw it as a waste of valuable training time when sailors needed to learn complex technical skills. But Barrett persisted, gathering data to support his theory. He tracked correlations between bed inspection scores and performance in other areas of training, demonstrating that recruits who mastered this basic task typically excelled in more complex assignments as well. Rack making is the foundation upon which we build sailors, Barrett argued, in a memo to the station's commanding officer. It tests their willingness to meet standards, their attention to detail, and their ability to follow instructions precisely. A man who cannot or will not make his rack properly will likely fail in more critical tasks that require the same mental discipline. The commanding officer, Captain Arthur Radford, was initially skeptical, but gave Barrett permission to conduct a formal study. For 3 months, Barrett tracked 2 groups of recruits through their training. One group received the standard curriculum, while the other experienced an intensified focus on basic routines, particularly rack making. The results were striking. The experimental group showed significantly better performance in technical training, higher scores in emergency drills, and fewer disciplinary problems. Most convincingly, when these sailors were followed into their first assignments, their commanding officers reported higher levels of readiness and adaptability compared to other new arrivals. The effect was most pronounced during crisis situations, the exact conditions that matter most in combat. By early 1943, as the United States began its island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, Barrett's approach had gained influential supporters. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, took particular interest in Barrett's data and authorized a formal study across multiple training centers. The results were compelling. Sailors who consistently passed bed inspections showed significantly better performance in emergency drills, exhibited greater attention to equipment maintenance, and received fewer disciplinary citations. Most importantly, when these sailors were followed into combat assignments, their units reported higher efficiency and lower casualty rates than those with poorer inspection records. This isn't mere correlation, Barrett wrote in his report to Nimitz. The mental habits formed through consistent attention to basic routines create a foundation for performance under pressure. When a sailor has trained himself to make his rack perfectly each morning, even when tired, even when it seems pointless, he's developing the exact discipline needed to perform his duties perfectly during battle when lives depend on it. Nimitz, known for his analytical mind and openness to innovative approaches, was impressed. In February 1943, he sent a directive to all Pacific Fleet commanders endorsing Barrett's findings and emphasizing the importance of maintaining high standards for routine shipboard disciplines. The difference between victory and defeat in naval combat often hinges on small details, Nimitz wrote. A torpedo setting miscalculated by 1 degree, a radar contact reported seconds too late, a damage control party responding a moment too slowly. Such small errors cost ships and lives. The habits of precision that prevent these errors must be developed through daily discipline in all aspects of naval service, beginning with the most basic routines. In March 1943, Barrett was promoted to lieutenant commander and assigned to develop a fleet-wide training program based on his findings. The result was Naval Training Directive 43-7, better known throughout the fleet as the Barrett Method. While comprehensive in scope, covering everything from hygiene to equipment care, the directive's sections on bunk maintenance became its most famous, and initially its most ridiculed feature. The Barrett Method specified in exacting detail how a sailor's rack should be prepared. Sheets pulled drum-tight with precise hospital corners, blankets folded with edges perfectly aligned, pillows positioned exactly 6 inches from the head of the mattress. Inspections were to be conducted daily, with specific demerits for wrinkles, improper folds, or misalignments as small as 1/4 inch. A properly made rack, the directive stated, is not merely a matter of appearance. It is a reflection of a sailor's mind, his attention to detail, his willingness to meet standards, his self-discipline. These qualities determine not only his individual readiness for combat, but his reliability as a member of the crew. In battle, when lives depend on each man performing his duty perfectly, such qualities make the difference between victory and defeat, survival and death. To ensure consistent implementation across the fleet, Barrett developed a training program for chiefs and petty officers who would conduct the actual inspections. This train-the-trainer approach included not just the technical standards for proper rack making, but also the psychological principles behind the practice. When inspecting racks, you're not just checking sheets and blankets, Barrett told these senior enlisted leaders. You're evaluating each sailor's mental readiness for combat. The rack is the visible manifestation of invisible qualities: precision, attention to detail, commitment to standards. These are the qualities that will keep your ship fighting even when damaged, that will save lives when seconds count. As the Barrett method was implemented across the expanding fleet, it met with predictable resistance from both veterans and new recruits. Many seasoned sailors saw it as an unnecessary burden, while fresh-faced recruits couldn't understand the relevance of perfect bed-making to fighting a war. The naval humor magazine The Fantail published a satirical piece titled "How to Win the War, Make Your Bed," which became popular reading among disgruntled sailors throughout the Pacific. Even some officers were skeptical. Lieutenant Commander Richard Harrison of the destroyer USS Fletcher famously quipped, "I don't recall the Japanese asking to inspect our racks before they started shooting at us." Barrett anticipated this resistance and developed a strategy to overcome it. Rather than simply imposing the standards and punishing failures, he created a narrative that connected bedmaking to combat readiness in ways sailors could understand. He trained officers and petty officers to explain not just how beds should be made, but why this discipline mattered in the larger context of naval warfare. "The sea is an unforgiving environment," began one of Barrett's training lectures, copies of which were distributed to every ship in the fleet. "It seeks out weakness and exploits it without mercy. So do our enemies. On a naval vessel there is no room for imprecision, no tolerance for good enough. Either a task is done correctly, or it risks the entire ship and crew. We start with your rack because it's the first task you face each day. Master it, and you begin building the habits that will keep you alive when the shooting starts." To reinforce this message, Barrett collected testimonials from combat veterans who attributed their survival to the discipline they'd developed through naval routines. These accounts, distributed as pamphlets and posters, helped new sailors connect the seemingly mundane task of bedmaking to the deadly serious business of war. One such testimonial came from gunner's mate, First Class Raymond Turner, a survivor of the USS Indianapolis, which had been damaged in a kamikaze attack. "When the explosion threw me across the compartment, I didn't panic," Turner recounted. "I'd spent months having to think clearly and act precisely each morning while still half asleep, making my rack to the chief's standards. When the moment came that mattered, my mind knew what to do: focus on the details, follow procedure, stay disciplined. That training saved my life and helped me save others." Another came from machinist's mate, Second Class Robert Hargrove, who had served aboard the destroyer USS Johnston during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Johnston, along with a handful of other small American vessels, had charged an overwhelming Japanese fleet to protect vulnerable transport ships, an action of extraordinary courage that naval historians would later call the last stand of the tin can sailors. When the captain gave the order to attack, no one questioned it, Hargrove recalled. "We'd been trained to execute orders immediately and perfectly, whether that meant making our racks at 5:30 or charging a battleship with our tiny destroyer. That discipline saved thousands of lives, even though many of us didn't make it back." These testimonials from men who had faced the ultimate test of combat carried weight that no amount of theoretical justification could match. Gradually, resistance to the Barrett method began to diminish, replaced by a growing recognition of its practical value. The timing of this shift in attitude coincided with a crucial phase of the Pacific War. By mid-1943, as American naval forces began taking the offensive, the nature of the conflict was changing. Earlier battles had been largely defensive, with American forces reacting to Japanese initiatives. Now, with industrial production reaching full capacity and training pipelines delivering thousands of new sailors monthly, the U.S. Navy was mounting increasingly complex offensive operations. These operations required unprecedented levels of coordination between ships, aircraft, and landing forces. The margin for error was slim, and the consequences of mistakes were measured in American lives. In this environment, the discipline and attention to detail fostered by Barrett's emphasis on basic routines, with bedmaking as its cornerstone, began to show measurable results. Ships that had fully implemented the Barrett method reported fewer accidents, better equipment readiness, and more efficient damage control when hit by enemy fire. Personnel transfers between vessels became smoother as sailors arrived already accustomed to the same standards. Most significantly, when sailors were interviewed after combat engagements, those from ships with strict enforcement of Barrett's protocols consistently reported greater confidence in their shipmates and officers. "You know, if a man can make his rack right, he can probably load ammunition right," explained boatswain's mate, Second Class Daniel Reeves of the USS Enterprise, in a 1944 interview with Stars and Stripes. "It's all about doing things the right way every time. That's how you stay alive out here." The transformation was perhaps most evident in the submarine service, where the demands for precision were highest and the consequences of error most immediate. In the confined space of a submarine, where 40 men might live for months in a space the size of a modest apartment, discipline and attention to detail weren't luxuries. They were necessities for survival. Every valve must be opened or closed exactly as specified, every gauge reading reported precisely, every piece of equipment maintained perfectly, explained Commander Eugene Fluckey of the submarine USS Barb, one of the most successful submarine skippers of the war. "A single error can send a boat and all hands to the bottom. We found that sailors who mastered the discipline of perfect rack-making typically mastered these more critical skills as well. It sounds strange to civilians, but in our world, the way a man makes his bed really can predict whether he'll survive combat." The USS Barb would go on to become one of the most decorated submarines of World War II, sinking 17 enemy vessels and even conducting a raid on Japanese soil, the only American ground combat operation on the Japanese home islands. Fluckey attributed much of this success to the extraordinary discipline of his crew, a discipline built on the foundation of routine excellence that Barrett had championed. While Barrett's methodical approach was proving its worth in the Pacific, the human element remained challenging. Naval vessels were crowded, offering minimal privacy and personal space. On smaller ships like destroyers and submarines, sailors often practiced hot racking, where 3 men would share 2 beds, rotating according to watch schedules. In such confined quarters, maintaining strict standards required extraordinary discipline. For many sailors, their rack represented their only personal territory amid the cramped communal environment of a warship. The tight living conditions tested men's patience and adaptability. A destroyer might house 300 men in a space smaller than a modest apartment building, with each sailor allocated storage space that could fit inside a standard suitcase. Your rack and your small locker were the only things that belonged just to you, recalled Radioman Third Class Henry Winters, who served aboard the USS O'Bannon. Everything else was shared: the head, the mess tables, the passageways. Making your rack wasn't just about discipline. It was about creating a small corner of order in the middle of chaos. The psychological importance of this ordered personal space became apparent as the war progressed and deployments lengthened. Ships sometimes remained at sea for months without touching land, their crews enduring not only the threat of enemy attack, but also the grinding stress of confinement, monotony, and separation from loved ones. In this pressure cooker environment, the daily ritual of rack-making served as an anchor, a predictable routine that provided structure amid uncertainty. Navy psychologists noted that sailors who maintained orderly personal spaces typically showed better psychological resilience than those who became slovenly as deployments wore on. The state of a sailor's rack became a reliable indicator of his mental condition, wrote Navy psychiatrist Lieutenant Commander Robert Sears in a 1944 report. When a man who previously maintained perfect standards begins to grow careless with his bed, it often signals developing problems that warrant attention before they affect his performance of duties. This observation led to a refinement of Barrett's methods. While rack inspections remained stringent, they evolved to serve a dual purpose, not merely enforcing discipline, but also monitoring sailors' well-being. Chief petty officers who conducted most day-to-day inspections were trained to distinguish between occasional sloppiness and the kind of persistent deterioration that might indicate more serious issues. On aircraft carriers, the Navy's largest vessels, the importance of this attention to detail was magnified by the inherent dangers of flight operations. The flight deck of a World War II carrier was among the most hazardous workplaces on Earth, where a moment's inattention could send men into spinning propellers or jet exhaust or allow loose equipment to be sucked into an aircraft engine with catastrophic results. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Williams, Air Operations Officer on the USS Intrepid, explained the connection in a 1945 interview. The habits formed in making a rack each morning, checking every corner, ensuring everything is secure, maintaining absolute attention to detail, these same habits keep men alive on the flight deck. When you've trained yourself to notice and correct the smallest imperfection in your bedding, you're more likely to notice the loose equipment or misplaced tool that might otherwise cause a disaster. By 1944, as the tide of the Pacific War turned decisively in America's favor, the Barrett method had become so ingrained in naval culture that new recruits often arrived at their first ships having already internalized its principles. The initial resistance had largely faded, replaced by a grudging recognition of its value, and in many cases, by genuine pride in upholding the standards. The impact extended beyond individual sailors to influence the Navy's broader approach to training and operations. Barrett's emphasis on mastering basic tasks as a foundation for more complex skills became a guiding philosophy, reflected in everything from engineering procedures to combat drills. We discovered that excellence in small things predicts excellence in large things, Admiral Raymond Spruance explained in a 1945 address to naval commanders. The sailor who makes his rack with precision tends to perform his combat duties with the same attention to detail. We've built a Navy that sweats the small stuff because in combat there are no small mistakes, only fatal ones. As Allied forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, the tempo of naval operations increased. American sailors faced not only conventional attacks, but also the desperate fury of kamikaze suicide planes. In this environment of heightened danger, the discipline instilled through Barrett's methods proved increasingly valuable. Ships that maintained the highest standards of routine discipline typically responded most effectively to emergencies. When the destroyer USS Laffey was attacked by 22 kamikazes on April 16, 1945, the crew's disciplined response, continuing to man their stations and fight fires even as explosions tore through the vessel, allowed the ship to survive despite severe damage. 32 men died in that attack, but the Laffey remained afloat, a testament to the crew's training and discipline. The ship's executive officer later credited their survival to hundreds of hours of drills and the habit of doing things right the first time, every time, a habit that began with making their racks each morning. The USS Laffey's experience was not unique. Throughout the fleet, ships that had embraced Barrett's emphasis on disciplined routine consistently demonstrated superior performance in crisis situations. When damage control parties responded to fires or flooding, when gun crews maintained their rates of fire despite casualties, when engineering teams kept propulsion systems functioning despite battle damage. In all these scenarios, the mental discipline fostered by Barrett's methods proved its worth. By early 1945, as planning began for the anticipated invasion of Japan, Barrett's approach had become standard doctrine throughout the Navy. The methodology had evolved based on combat experience, but its core principle remained unchanged. Excellence in basic disciplines creates the foundation for excellence under fire. The Barrett method works because it addresses human psychology, not just naval regulations, explained Captain William Parsons, who served as an ordnance specialist on the Manhattan Project but maintained close connections with the fleet. It recognizes that under extreme stress, people don't rise to the occasion. They fall to the level of their training. By making excellence habitual in small matters, it ensures that excellence becomes the default response even in crisis. As the war neared its conclusion, Lieutenant Commander Barrett received orders to Washington, D.C., where he joined a team planning for the Navy's post-war transition. The challenge now was different, but no less daunting: how to maintain the hard-won standards of discipline as the service rapidly demobilized and thousands of combat veterans returned to civilian life. Barrett argued forcefully against relaxing standards during this transition. "The discipline that won this war wasn't a temporary measure," he wrote in a 1945 memorandum to the Chief of Naval Personnel. "It represents the foundation of naval effectiveness in peace as well as war." The moment we begin viewing these standards as situational rather than fundamental, we begin undermining the force that defeated two great maritime powers. His perspective prevailed. While the Navy would shrink dramatically after 1945, the standards of discipline codified in the Barrett method remained largely intact, becoming permanently woven into the fabric of naval culture. Generations of sailors who never heard Barrett's name would nevertheless feel his influence each morning as they pulled their sheets tight and folded their blankets with mathematical precision. Barrett himself remained in the Navy after the war, rising to the rank of captain before retiring in 1962. In his later years, he seemed bemused by the outsized attention given to the bed-making components of his training methodology, often noting that they represented just one facet of a comprehensive approach to naval discipline. People remember the rack inspections because they seemed so trivial compared to the life-or-death matters of war, he reflected in a 1970 interview. What they miss is that there are no trivial matters aboard a warship. Everything connects. The same attention that makes a perfect rack makes a perfect depth charge setting or a perfectly timed course correction. It's all one piece. The legacy of Barrett's approach extended far beyond the Navy. After the war, veterans carried these habits of discipline and attention to detail into civilian careers, influencing American business, education, and culture. The post-war economic boom owed something to the millions of former servicemen who applied their military discipline to building businesses and communities. Among these veterans was former Seaman William Morris, who had stood nervously by his rack during those inspections aboard the USS Lexington in 1943. After the war, Morris used his GI Bill benefits to earn a degree in engineering, eventually founding a construction company that specialized in precision manufacturing for the aerospace industry. "Everything I accomplished after the Navy built on what I learned making those hospital corners," Morris told an interviewer in 1988. "It taught me that details matter, that standards exist for reasons beyond themselves, and that discipline isn't just about following rules, it's about building character that stands up when everything else is falling apart." Morris wasn't alone in this assessment. Across post-war America, former sailors applied the lessons of naval discipline to new challenges. They brought with them not just technical skills acquired during their service, but also the mental habits that Barrett had so carefully cultivated. Attention to detail, commitment to standards, and the discipline to do small things right every time. James Rickover, who would later lead the development of America's nuclear submarine fleet as a four-star admiral, was among those who recognized the enduring value of Barrett's approach. As a young officer during World War II, Rickover had initially dismissed the emphasis on bed-making as superficial. His perspective changed after observing the performance differences between crews who maintained high standards in daily routines and those who didn't. The reactor that powers a nuclear submarine is among the most complex machines ever built, Rickover later explained. Its safe operation depends entirely on the discipline of its operators, their willingness to follow procedures exactly, to verify every step, to maintain constant vigilance. These are precisely the qualities that Barrett's methods instill. We don't care about wrinkle-free sheets for their own sake. We care about the mental discipline they represent. Under Rickover's leadership, the Navy's nuclear power program would adopt an approach to training and operations that built directly on Barrett's foundation, emphasizing absolute precision in even the smallest tasks. This methodology enabled the United States to develop and safely operate the world's most advanced submarine fleet, a key strategic advantage during the Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union. In the broader society, the influence of naval discipline was less explicit, but equally significant. The generation of men who fought World War II, often called the Greatest Generation by later historians, brought with them into civilian life the habits and values they'd learned in military service. These were men who had been taught that details matter, that excellence isn't optional, and that individual discipline contributes to collective success, explained sociologist Margaret Weston in her 1972 study of post-war American culture. They applied these principles to building suburbs, running corporations, and raising families. The post-war economic miracle owed much to their approach to life and work. Not all aspects of military discipline translated smoothly to civilian life, of course. The rigid hierarchies and unquestioning obedience that served the wartime Navy well sometimes created tensions in democratic workplaces and egalitarian families. As the decades passed and the direct memory of World War II faded, some elements of the Barrett approach came to seem antiquated or unnecessarily harsh. Yet the core insight that excellence in small things builds the foundation for excellence in large things retained its validity. Modern research in psychology and performance optimization has repeatedly confirmed what Barrett intuited through observation and experience, that habits of discipline and attention to detail create mental pathways that serve individuals well in all areas of life. What Barrett discovered through practical observation, we now understand through neuroscience, explained Dr. Rebecca Chen, a researcher in performance psychology at Stanford University. When you repeatedly perform tasks with precision and attention to detail, you're actually rewiring neural pathways in your brain. You're training yourself to notice what others miss, to maintain focus despite distractions, and to execute with precision even under stress. These capabilities transfer across domains, from making a bed to performing surgery or managing a crisis. Today, more than 8 decades after Barrett first emphasized the importance of a perfectly made rack, the tradition continues in naval training facilities across America. While many aspects of the Navy have transformed with changing technology and social attitudes, the fundamental emphasis on discipline through mastery of basic tasks remains constant. At Naval Station Great Lakes, where most enlisted sailors still begin their naval careers, recruits continue to learn the precise art of rack-making during their first days of boot camp. The standards remain exacting, the inspections thorough. Chief petty officers still drop coins on the tightly drawn surfaces, expecting them to bounce. Of course they complain about it, said Senior Chief Petty Officer Michael Ramirez, who supervised recruit training at Great Lakes in 2015. Every generation of sailors has complained about it, going back to World War II and before. But later, when they're serving on ships and facing real challenges, they understand. The discipline becomes part of them, and it serves them well. These modern sailors train in facilities far more comfortable than the crowded ships of World War II. They will serve on vessels with advanced technology that Barrett's generation could hardly have imagined. But when they pull their sheets tight each morning, forming those same crisp hospital corners, they connect directly to the sailors who fought across the Pacific, maintaining this small discipline even as battles raged around them. The relationship between bed-making and battle readiness extends beyond the Navy to other branches of the military as well. In his popular 2014 commencement speech at the University of Texas, Admiral William McRaven, a Navy SEAL who helped plan the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, emphasized the importance of making your bed each morning. "If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed," McRaven told the graduates. "If you make your bed every morning, you will have accomplished the first task of the day. It will give you a small sense of pride, and it will encourage you to do another task, and another, and another. And by the end of the day, that one task completed will have turned into many tasks completed." McRaven's speech, which subsequently went viral and was expanded into a best-selling book, brought Barrett's core insight to a new generation far removed from the experiences of World War II. Though McRaven never mentioned Barrett by name, the connection between them likely unknown to him, he was propagating the same fundamental principle, that discipline in small things builds the foundation for achievement in large ones. In today's Navy, as in the civilian world beyond, the specific application of this principle may have evolved, but its essential truth remains unchanged. Whether maintaining nuclear reactors on aircraft carriers, operating advanced sonar systems on submarines, or coordinating complex joint operations with other military branches, naval personnel still rely on the habits of discipline and attention to detail that Barrett recognized as crucial during World War II. The specific challenges change with technology and geopolitics, explained Admiral Thomas Wilson, who commanded the USS Carl Vinson Aircraft Carrier Group in the early 21st century. But the human element remains constant. In crisis situations, people revert to their training. If that training has instilled precise habits and attention to detail, beginning with something as basic as making a bed properly, they'll perform effectively even under extreme pressure. It seems fitting that this simple act, making a bed properly, endures as one of the Navy's most recognized traditions. In its precision and attention to detail, it embodies the qualities that transform ordinary citizens into sailors capable of extraordinary service. It represents both the beginning of each sailor's day and the beginning of their transformation into someone who can be trusted with the nation's defense. In the early hours aboard today's Navy ships, as sailors rise before dawn to begin their duties, the ritual continues, sheets pulled tight, corners folded with precision, surfaces smooth enough to reflect light. In performing this daily act, each sailor renews the legacy of discipline that carried the Navy through its greatest test in World War II. They honor not only the formal standards established by Lieutenant Commander James Barrett, but also the deeper truth he recognized, that victory in war, like excellence in life, is built upon the foundation of doing ordinary things with extraordinary care. The mathematics of naval victory were indeed written in hospital corners and tightly drawn sheets. A lesson as relevant in today's complex world as it was amid the desperate battles of the Pacific War. For the aging veterans of that conflict and the few who still remain with us, the connection between bedmaking and survival was never merely theoretical. It represented a concrete reality they lived daily, where discipline in small matters created the mental habits that kept them alive when bombs fell and torpedoes struck. You learn to do everything right, even the small stuff, because at sea there's no room for error, explained Raymond Henderson, who served as a gunner aboard the USS Missouri during World War II in a 2010 interview at age 94. Making your rack right was just the beginning. But if you couldn't even do that properly, how could anyone trust you to load ammunition or man a battle station. It all connects. Today's sailors serve in a Navy transformed by technology, with ships and systems that would seem like science fiction to their World War II predecessors. Yet human nature remains unchanged. The need for discipline, attention to detail, and commitment to standards is as vital now as it was when Barrett first codified his approach. Some things in the Navy have changed dramatically since World War II, observed Master Chief Petty Officer Cheryl Williams, who served as the top enlisted advisor aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush. But the fundamentals of naval service remain the same. We still need sailors who pay attention to details, who do things right every time, who maintain discipline even when no one's watching. That's why we still insist on properly made racks, just as we did 80 years ago. As we look to the future, with its uncertain challenges and evolving threats, the lesson of Barrett's method remains relevant not just for the Navy, but for all who seek excellence in any field. The path to mastery begins with mastering the basics. Discipline in small matters builds the foundation for achievement in great ones. And attention to detail, whether in making a bed or performing brain surgery or coding an algorithm, separates excellence from mediocrity. Would you have understood, as Barrett did, that something as seemingly trivial as making a bed could help win history's greatest naval conflict? Or would you, like so many before you, have dismissed it as pointless routine? Perhaps the next time you make your own bed, or choose not to, you might reflect on how such small choices, multiplied across time and circumstance, shape not only individual character, but the course of history itself. Comment below and share this story so others remember what discipline really means, and how the smallest actions can prepare us for our greatest challenges.